They had just finished celebrating a little girl's birthday. There was laughter. There was cake. There were smiles. By sunrise, 3 members of the same family would be dead. One child would somehow survive. And the monster responsible would disappear into the shadows, leaving behind one of Colorado's most horrifying unsolved mysteries. For more than 3 decades, detectives chased a ghost. A killer so savage that even seasoned investigators struggled to comprehend the brutality they witnessed inside that home. But what nobody knew was that the answer had been hiding in plain sight all along. And when the truth finally emerged, it exposed a trail of violence far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Before we begin, if you enjoy real-life true crime stories and unsolved mysteries that are finally brought to justice, make sure you like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and hit the subscribe button. It was a bitterly cold Monday morning outside Denver, Colorado. Connie Large Bennett had no idea her life was about to change forever. The phone rang. On the other end was her brother. His voice carried concern. Bruce Bennett and his wife, Deborah, had failed to show up for work. That wasn't like them. Bruce and Deborah worked for Bruce's uncle as regional distributors for Bassett Furniture. They were dependable and responsible. Repeated calls to the house had gone unanswered, and everyone was beginning to worry. What made the situation even stranger was that Connie had just seen them the night before. The family had gathered to celebrate young Melissa Bennett's birthday. Melissa was turning 8 years old. The house had been filled with laughter and excitement. Children ran around playing games while the adults talked and enjoyed the evening. Melissa was happy. Deborah had worked hard to make her daughter's birthday special. No one suspected that those joyful moments would become their final memories. As the celebration came to an end, family members said their goodbyes and headed home. Everything seemed perfectly normal. But by morning, something was terribly wrong. Connie's instincts told her she needed to get to the house immediately. Nothing could have prepared her for what she was about to discover. Investigators would later remember the scene with horror. After entering through the garage and making their way into the kitchen, they found Bruce Bennett lying on the floor. He had been viciously attacked. The injuries were horrifying. A hammer had been used to crush his face and head. His throat had been cut. The brutality was shocking. But the nightmare was only beginning. Officers entered the master bedroom. There, lying on the bed, was Deborah Bennett. She too had been bludgeoned to death. Then investigators moved toward the children's bedroom. What they discovered inside would haunt many of them for the rest of their lives. 7-year-old Melissa Bennett had also been murdered. She had suffered the same horrific injuries. And investigators would later determine that she had been sexually assaulted. Veteran detectives who had worked countless murders admitted they became physically sick. Some turned pale. Others struggled to speak. Many had children of their own. Seeing what happened inside that bedroom was almost too much to bear. The entire house had become a nightmare. 3 lives had been stolen. But amid all the horror, there was something nobody expected. A miracle. 3-year-old Vanessa Bennett had somehow survived. Rescuers found her hidden between the bed and the wall. Barely alive. She was clinging to life. Firefighters rushed her outside and immediately transported her to the hospital. Doctors worked desperately to save the little girl. Against overwhelming odds, she survived. Years later, Vanessa would recall fragments of waking up in the hospital. She remembered machines attached to her body. She remembered doctors and nurses. But she had no memory of the evil that had entered her home that night. And perhaps that was a blessing. Investigators knew they had little time to waste. Someone capable of such unimaginable violence was still out there. Their first step was obvious. Find the last people who had seen the Bennett family alive. The birthday guests. Everyone who attended Melissa's party was interviewed. Family members. Friends. relatives, anyone who had entered that home. One detail immediately stood out. As people were leaving that night, Richard Large reportedly noticed something unusual. The garage door was open. He reminded Connie to tell Bruce to close it before going to bed. Connie passed along the message. But for reasons no one could explain, Bruce apparently never shut the garage. Detectives believed the killer may have simply seen an opportunity. An open door. An easy target. And he slipped inside. Investigators searched desperately for clues. But the killer had left behind very little. The murder weapon was nowhere to be found. The hammer used in the attacks had vanished. However, near the driveway, partially covered by snow, investigators discovered a knife. It had been used to cut Bruce's throat. But despite their efforts, no usable fingerprints could be recovered. It seemed as though the killer had vanished into thin air. Then investigators entered the children's bedroom. There, hidden beneath Melissa's body and on the comforter that covered her, they discovered something that would become the key to solving the case. Biological evidence. At the time, it was an incredible discovery. But there was a problem. This was the mid-1980s. DNA technology was still in its infancy. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation simply didn't possess the ability to identify a suspect from the evidence. The samples were carefully preserved. And investigators hoped that one day science would catch up. But nobody knew how long that would take. As detectives searched for answers, another terrifying revelation emerged. Just days before the Bennett family murders, another woman named Patricia Smith had been attacked inside her own home. The similarities were impossible to ignore. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been beaten with a hammer. And she had been murdered with horrifying brutality. Investigators suspected they were dealing with a serial predator. But proving it would be another challenge entirely. Meanwhile, doctors hoped that little Vanessa might provide the answers they desperately needed. She was only 3 years old. Her head was wrapped in bandages. Her face showed signs of the attack she had somehow survived. Therapists tried gently asking questions. Investigators prayed she had seen something. Anything. But whenever conversations turned toward that terrible night, Vanessa became frightened and agitated. Eventually, they stopped. The trauma was simply too great. And with no eyewitnesses, no fingerprints, and technology unable to unlock the secrets hidden within the DNA evidence, the case began to grow cold. Months became years. Years became decades. And many feared the monster who destroyed the Bennett family would never be found. But science was about to change everything. And the breakthrough that investigators had prayed for would eventually expose a killer whose trail of violence stretched far beyond one family. And what detectives would uncover next would leave everyone stunned. For years, the Bennett family murders haunted Colorado investigators. The files grew thicker. The leads grew colder. And despite countless interviews and endless hours of work, the monster responsible remained a ghost. Little Vanessa Bennett grew up. Family members mourned. Detectives retired. But one thing never changed. The evidence. Locked away inside a laboratory was something the killer never imagined would one day betray him. His DNA. More than a decade after the murders, advances in forensic science finally gave investigators hope. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation was now capable of extracting DNA profiles from the biological evidence recovered inside Melissa Bennett's room. When scientists completed their work, the results were astonishing. The DNA belonged to a single male. Experts explained that the odds of someone else sharing that profile were nearly impossible. If investigators could find the owner of that DNA, they would find their killer. But there was one problem. No match existed. The profile wasn't in any criminal databases. The years continued to pass. Despite having the answer in their hands, investigators still didn't know whose answer it was. Then, decades later, science took another giant leap forward. Chief Deputy District Attorney John Kellner and Detective Steve Connor refused to give up. Instead of waiting for a traditional DNA match, they enlisted the help of genetic genealogist Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick. Her methods had helped solve mysteries that had baffled detectives for generations. Using publicly available DNA databases and family trees, she began tracing distant relatives connected to the unknown profile. Days later, she made a startling discovery. One surname continued appearing: Ewing. Detective Steve Connor was stunned. That name had never surfaced in any report. Not once. Still, investigators continued digging. Then, on a summer evening in 2018, Steve Connor received a phone call that changed everything. There had been a DNA hit. Not from Colorado. Not from some new suspect. But from an inmate sitting in prison in Nevada. The man responsible had been behind bars for decades. His name was Alex Ewing. Detectives could hardly believe it. For more than 30 years, the answer had been there all along. Even more shocking was what they discovered next. Alex Ewing had not stopped after the Bennett murders. Only days later, violence followed him across multiple states. In Arizona, he nearly beat a man to death with a rock. He brutally attacked 2 more people with an axe handle. Eventually, he was captured in Nevada and sentenced to prison for attempted murder. Meanwhile, no one realized he was also responsible for one of Colorado's most horrifying crimes. Investigators began examining his past. The deeper they looked, the more terrifying the picture became. This wasn't random violence. This was a predator. And his trail of destruction stretched far beyond one family. Prosecutors charged Alex Ewing with the murders of Bruce Bennett, Deborah Bennett, and 7-year-old Melissa Bennett. They also linked him to the murder of Patricia Smith, who had been attacked just days before the Bennett family massacre. But because of old laws in Colorado, prosecutors were unable to pursue charges in some of the attempted murders he committed decades earlier. Those crimes had exceeded the statute of limitations. Still, they had enough. And finally, after more than 3 decades, the Bennett family would receive justice. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors described Alex Ewing as a man driven by bloodlust. The DNA evidence was overwhelming. Jurors listened carefully. And when the verdicts were read, there was little surprise. Guilty. 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 Alex Ewing was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms. The judge called his crimes an abomination. For surviving daughter Vanessa Bennett, justice had arrived. But nothing could restore what had been stolen from her. 3 family members. An entire childhood. And memories forever marked by tragedy. Yet while investigators in Colorado were finally celebrating justice, another family hundreds of miles away had spent decades searching for answers of their own. And their nightmare began with a young woman known by an unusual nickname: Dark Angel. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who is truly following this heartbreaking story all the way to the end. Pamela Pitts was born in Michigan and grew up as the oldest of 4 children. Friends remembered her as energetic and outgoing. She loved talking on CB radios and had earned herself a nickname that everyone knew: Dark Angel. The name stuck. And in many ways, it became part of her identity. By the summer of 1988, Pamela had moved in with her best friend, Shelley Norgard. Her father had opposed the idea from the very beginning. Pam had her own room at home. She had privacy. She had family. But like many young adults, she wanted independence. Eventually, another roommate named Jeremy Anderson joined them to help with expenses. According to everyone who knew them, the 3 got along well. At least in the beginning. But money was becoming a problem. Rent payments were piling up. Stress was growing. And Pamela had started reconsidering her decision. One evening, she sat down for dinner with her father. During their conversation, she confessed something. She wanted to move back home. Paul Pitts was relieved. He had never wanted her to leave in the first place. He smiled and told her she could return whenever she wanted. They talked about her coming home that Saturday to do laundry and begin moving things back. Neither of them knew this would be their final meal together. After dinner, Pamela left. Her father watched her drive away. And that was the last time he ever saw his daughter alive. Days later, something wasn't right. Pamela failed to show up for work. Concerned, her father called her employer. She hadn't reported in. Immediately, panic set in. He contacted police and went to Pamela's home. Inside, officers found her purse, her driver's license, her medication, everything she would normally take with her. Nothing suggested she had planned to disappear. But Shelley Norgard seemed strangely calm. She told investigators she believed Pamela had gone out partying. She wasn't worried. Then she made another claim. The two women shared a bank account to pay rent. According to Shelley, she had deposited her share, but Pamela had emptied the account and refused to pay. Shelley seemed angry. But detectives had no reason to suspect anything more. At least not yet. Then came the horrifying discovery. Gordo's Pit was a remote area where young people often gathered for parties. One day, a man searching through debris noticed something sticking out from a pile of trash. It was a human foot. Authorities rushed to the scene. What they found shocked even experienced investigators. The body had been almost completely destroyed by fire. Garbage surrounded the remains. But one small item survived. Melted into the wrist bones was part of a bracelet. Investigators could still read fragments of two words. Dark Angel. They knew immediately. The victim was Pamela Pitts. And whoever had murdered her had tried to erase every trace of her existence. But as detectives would soon learn, Pamela's death was only the beginning. Because another murder was waiting in the shadows. And that murder would point directly towards someone nobody expected. Detectives were horrified by the condition of Pamela Pitts' body. The fire had destroyed much of the evidence, making it difficult to determine exactly how she had died. Investigators believed she had been killed somewhere else, stored for a period of time, and then dumped among the garbage before being set on fire. But proving it was another matter entirely. With few leads and almost no physical evidence, detectives turned their attention to the people closest to Pamela. Her roommates. Jeremy Anderson told investigators that on the night Pamela disappeared, he had attended a football game before spending time with friends. His story checked out. Shelley Norgard gave a different account. She claimed she had worked that evening and later spent time with her boyfriend, Ray Clerks. According to Shelley, they had remained together until the early hours of the morning. Investigators questioned Ray. His statements matched Shelley's. To be certain, police administered a polygraph examination. Ray agreed. And he passed. With no evidence pointing toward either roommate, the investigation slowly lost momentum. Weeks turned into months. Months became years. For Pamela's father, Paul Pitts, the silence was unbearable. At first, detectives would occasionally call with updates. But as time passed, the calls became less frequent. Eventually, they stopped altogether. The case had gone cold. But fate was about to deliver another shocking twist. Several years later, students exploring an abandoned mine near Iron Springs Road made a gruesome discovery. Deep inside a vertical shaft was a body. Authorities recovered the remains and identified the victim. It was Ray Clerks, Shelley Norgard's boyfriend. He had been shot in the head. For investigators, the coincidence was impossible to ignore. The boyfriend of Pamela's roommate had now been murdered as well. detectives immediately launched a new investigation. At the entrance to the mine shaft, they discovered tire tracks. Those tracks led them to a truck that had recently been borrowed by Shelley Norgard. Investigators obtained a search warrant. Inside the residence, they found blood. Then they approached Shelley's car. Even before opening it, detectives documented something they would never forget. The smell. The odor of death. Inside the trunk was blood. Tests revealed it matched Ray Clerk's. Under the front seat, investigators discovered a firearm. Ballistic analysis later showed it was the same caliber used in Ray's murder. The evidence was overwhelming. Shelley Norgard was arrested. At first, she insisted she was innocent. For 2 years she maintained that position. But eventually, she changed her story. She admitted to killing Ray Clerks. Investigators believed she had murdered him inside the apartment, left his body in the trunk of her car for days, and later transferred his remains into a four-wheel-drive truck before dumping him in the abandoned mine. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison. But for many detectives, one question remained unanswered. What about Pamela Pitts? Now that Shelley was a convicted killer, they believed there had to be more to the story. They just couldn't prove it. Years later, Shelley completed her prison sentence. She walked out of prison as a free woman. But some investigators had never stopped thinking about Pamela. They revisited old evidence, reviewed old interviews, and then they discovered something unexpected. Prison phone calls. Like many correctional facilities, inmate conversations had been recorded. Among those recordings were several calls between Shelley and her father. As detectives listened, they noticed something strange. Shelley's father repeatedly expressed concern that authorities might arrest her the moment she was released. He referred to one specific night. The night Pamela disappeared. Investigators sensed fear in his voice. And then, during one call, something happened. Shelley returned to the phone. Suddenly, the conversation stopped. Silence. To detectives, that silence spoke volumes. It became the breakthrough they had waited decades to find. Armed with new information, prosecutors approached Pamela's family with an unusual proposal. They could seek justice. But there would be a price. If Shelley confessed and revealed what happened, she would receive a plea agreement and be sentenced to time already served. For Paul Pitts, the decision was heartbreaking. He knew many people would criticize him. But after decades without answers, knowing the truth mattered more than revenge. And so they agreed. To everyone's surprise, Shelley accepted. In court, she finally stood and uttered the words Pamela's family had waited decades to hear. She admitted she had murdered Pamela Pitts. According to her statement, she had become furious over money. Pamela was planning to move out, leaving Shelley unable to pay the rent alone. Shelley claimed she went looking for her. She knew Pamela often attended parties at Gordo's Pit. Eventually, she found her. An argument broke out. A fight followed. Shelley said she punched Pamela, knocking her to the ground. Then she climbed on top of her and continued hitting her. Again. And again. And again. Until Pamela stopped breathing. That was her version of events. But investigators weren't convinced. They believed Shelley was still withholding information. After all, Pamela's burned body had been discovered among garbage. Had someone else set the fire? Had Shelley moved the body? Had another person helped her? No one knew. And because of the plea agreement, many questions would remain forever unanswered. Paul Pitts never received the complete truth. He was never allowed to ask the questions that haunted him. The legal agreement had closed the door. And although Shelley now stood convicted of 2 murders, she would spend no additional time behind bars. For Pamela's family, justice had come with painful compromises. But at least one thing could never be erased. The truth. Pamela Pitts had not disappeared. She had not run away. She had been murdered by someone she trusted. Someone she called a friend. And as devastating as that truth was, it finally allowed her loved ones to place responsibility where it belonged. But before detectives could fully close the chapter on one mystery, another case was waiting. Another victim. Another woman without a name. And another killer who believed time had buried his crimes forever. He was wrong. Because cold cases have a way of speaking. Even after decades. And when science finally catches up with evil, the truth has nowhere left to hide. If you made it this far, thank you for being part of Cold Case 247. These victims deserve to be remembered, and their stories deserve to be told. If you believe forgotten cases matter, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who loves true crime, and hit the subscribe button so you never miss another story where justice refuses to give up. Because no matter how many years pass, some secrets refuse to stay buried.